The saying "live by the sword, die by the sword" seems to hold true for many of history's most notorious dictators. This video delves into the violent ends of four autocratic rulers who held absolute power and saw their reigns of tyranny come to a bloody and gruesome end. Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania, Benito Mussolini of Italy, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, and Samuel Doe of Liberia all met their fate in violent ways that left an indelible mark on their country's history. From the humiliation and grotesque execution of Ceausescu to the torture and beheading of Doe, the downfall of these men who accepted unrestricted power only to end up becoming targets themselves. Nicolae Ceausescu, Romania. Nicolae Ceausescu remained president of Romania between 1967 and 1989. As the last communist leader of Romania, his rule was one of tyranny and incompetency. His introduction of communist policies plunged the country into an economic crisis. Living standards drastically deteriorated during his office. Public sentiment took a turn for the worse by the late 80s. Most if not all of the country was against Nicolae. In a desperate attempt to make one final appeal to the public, he held a speech on December 21, 1989. The response was unexpected for Nicolae. He and his wife were forced to flee the angry mob on their helicopter. However, they were soon arrested by the military, trialed, and sentenced to death. The execution took place on the Christmas of 1989 in a rather humiliating and grotesque fashion. The couple was blindfolded, lined up against the wall of a toilet block, and riddled with bullets by a firing squad, thus marking the end of communism in Romania. Benito Mussolini, Italy. Elected Prime Minister of Italy following the March of Rome in 1922, Mussolini adopted a series of methods to eliminate political rivals and introduced policies that set the foundation for a fascist form of government. He achieved this through the use of his secret police force and by passing laws that outlawed strikes. As the founder of the National Fascist Party, he expressed an interest in the war and advocated for the spread of fascism during the interwar period. However, he lost a majority of his supporters in the Fascist Party after victory in the Second World War seemed an unlikely reality, and was subsequently ousted from politics in 1943. This spelled the end of Mussolini's reign of tyranny, and he sensed the imminent danger to his life. In an interview in 1945, he stated, "7 years ago I was a person of interest. Now I am closer to a corpse." In April of 1945, Mussolini and his mistress were attempting to flee to Spain when they were kidnapped by Italian partisans and shot. Their bodies were paraded through Milan and hung upside down in Piazzale Loreto. News reports of the time claimed the corpses were spat on and pelted with rocks. Muammar Gaddafi, Libya. Molded from a young age by his religious beliefs, Gaddafi's rise to power in 1969 brought with it a complete conversion of Libya into an Islamic socialist state. His reign spanned 4 decades and resulted in several political reforms and foreign policies founded on his radical ideologies. He remained the head of Libyan military and the Revolutionary Committee to oversee the country from a position of absolute power. His military endeavors and questionable foreign policy made him an enemy of the NATO countries and resulted in the US bombing of Libya in 1986, followed by economic sanctions by the UN. The subsequent economic crisis in Libya called for public outcry, and the situation escalated into a full-blown civil war. NATO military intervention saw Gaddafi's government overthrown and replaced by the anti-Gaddafist National Transitional Council (NTC). Forced to flee, Gaddafi sought refuge in his hometown of Sirte, which fell at the hands of the NATO-NTC coalition in October 2011. Reports state that Gaddafi was hiding in a drainage pipe when he was found by the Libyan forces, and footage from bystanders reveals a blooded Gaddafi being held captive, beaten, and dragged around. He was eventually shot in the head and his body was displayed in a freezer in Misrata for several days. Samuel Doe, Liberia. Doe rose to power as the de facto head of state following a coup d'état in 1980. He was quick to introduce reforms and even quicker in eliminating opposition leaders. He suspended the Liberian constitution in favor of a military government called a military junta. Within 5 years, he had ordered an election and became president of Liberia in 1985. This election was subject to controversy on the grounds of election fraud, and many began to publicly oppose him. He was able to remain in power with the aid of the US, who considered him a valuable ally to have in light of the Cold War, showering his regime with crucial foreign aid. This alliance was short-lived, however, when in the late 80s, the Cold War was taking its final breath and the communism threat was waning. The US adopted policies limiting foreign aid to Liberia, and without the political backup of the states, Doe found himself at the mercy of the riled-up Liberians. Civil war broke out in 1989 and the rebels managed to overthrow Doe's government. Doe was lured to his capture by his closest colleagues who wanted his removal from office. Reports state he was tortured for hours on end, having his ears, toes, fingers, and finally, his head cut off. He who strikes fear in others is himself continually in fear. These men knew well where the road led and chose to make that sacrifice for power. The path paved with blood usually leads to a slaughter. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more fascinating stories from history.